it's an absolutely critical inflection point where NATO should act in a unified way in support of what the United States is doing. The United States and, of course, the NATO Transatlantic Alliance has been around for decades, and it's a powerful one. And it's not something that, should be completely discarded in any way. That being said, this is something that historically there have been a lot of statements, but what President Trump has done in the past year or so is really encourage NATO to step up. And that looks like increased defense spending, but it also looks like pushing out support, even if it's with words, but more can should be done from a unified NATO front to support what the United States is doing in the region. This is something that both Secretary Hegseth and President Trump have been very consistent on. There are opportunities for NATO to step up and do more. And some countries, have issued statements and some actually hem and hawed. But at the end of the day, more can and should be done from NATO. And I think it's very clear here. If that alliance is going to step up and fulfill the overwhelming purpose of which it serves, which of course is primarily defensive, but I think symbolically, the U.S.-NATO alliance is critical when looking at actually restoring deterrence globally, both here in this conflict in Iran, but also in a much larger geopolitical contest that could emerge with other countries as well. The U.S. is prepared for any and all contingencies. We saw this discussion with the U.S. and U.K. over the use of Diego Garcia. Of course, the Prime Minister has since come out, although there was some hemming and hawing about this at the beginning and being very clear to distance himself and the country, the U.K., from any sort of participation in the Iran strikes. That being said, coming out and allowing and publicly supporting the U.S. using UK infrastructure is good. That being said, I think that our European allies and NATO as a whole should allow the freedom of operation and action, just like we would do in a situation if NATO were threatened. When you look at Greenland, that was obviously a very touchy subject for some countries in the alliance. That being said, Iran for decades has been a huge promoter and funder of terrorism all across the globe, attacks that have happened in Europe, in many NATO and European countries. And so for me, it is quite shocking that we're seeing a difficult time for many NATO members to fully unify and step up in support of the United States in what the U.S. and Israel is doing in Iran. Actually, Europe and NATO have the most to gain from neutralizing the threat that emanate from Iran. When you look at whether the ballistic missile threat or some of the state-sponsored terrorism threats, Europe has been on the receiving end of much more of these threats than the United States has in some cases. And so I think ultimately it really comes down to the desire for American leadership, which has been very clear and very strong initiative of taking action to actually neutralize this threat. And frankly, I think some of our European allies can do a lot more to not just support with words, which should be the bare minimum here, but also support with actual tangible action, because Europe and NATO as a whole has a tremendous amount to gain from U.S. and Israeli actions in the region.